Fantastic. I think we're good to start there. So good afternoon once again. This afternoon, the main thrust of us being here is to examine a particular area of contribution, particularly as it relates to John Maynard Keynes and his technical and policy contributions within the context of macroeconomics, and as we would have established previously, underpinning the entire construct of macroeconomics for Keynes, and for economics in a wider sense, is that of labor and labor relations. So what I want us to do is to focus this afternoon particularly on what his contributions would have been, and the way that we examine it in a fundamental and a philosophical manner. So, for example, we make reference to something in economics called the Keynesian mindset or the Keynesian paradigm. And four important elements in the Keynesian paradigm prevailed during what is known as the Golden Age of Capitalism. This is a period subsequent to the Great Depression, where Keynesian economics enjoyed its greatest amount of confidence and the greatest quantum of support in a broad-based policy sense, without the intellectual rigor that later became the debates subsequent to the 1970s. Now, what are those four important elements of the Keynesian mindset as we understand it? So the first is that economies are viewed as being sticky and not fluid. So they adjust to shocks relatively slowly. Now, the reason that this is important within the Keynesian construct is that if one tracks back to the neoclassical paradigm, you'll see that a reference is made oftentimes to what is spoken about as being flexible in the labor markets. Now, it is assumed that when a period of unemployment sets in as a result of a disequilibrated situation occurring between demand and supply interplay, that amount of unemployment that is seen will essentially be forced back to equilibrium through interplay in the labor market as a result of the labor market being flexible. Now, this entire view stems from the fact that neoclassicism as a paradigm of economic thought is actually one that is heavily influenced by the notion of physics and this very fluid movement which occurs in the natural sciences. Now, the fact that natural sciences, and in particular physics, operates within an environment where when movement occurs, it is not bounded by institutional rigidities that may exist. It is not bounded by the fact that you are dealing with live individuals who may or may not make rational decisions. And this is part of the reason why so many assumptions are made in economics, because in that axiomatic approach, what you are trying to recreate is an environment where movement and behavior by rational actors are not the movement and the operations of rational actors are not stymied by anything which may arise as a result of a man-made consequence. So economies being viewed as sticky means fundamentally that there are time periods in which decisions are to be made, what is called intertemporal decision making. So for example, one will make a particular decision that will benefit an individual today, or one may make a particular decision that will be beneficial for one within a period of a short term. but it may not be so for the long term. And so another very popular one within labor economics is that of contracts. A contract may be set that prevents a very rapid adjustment in wage, and that actually is one of the greatest impediments that we see to what is known as a fluid labor market. So this becomes very important because adjusting to shocks uh, in a labor market that is seen as sticky and not being fluid is one that occurs much more slowly. And this is the reason why when we examine what is known as the liberal market economies, you'll find that some countries tend to set their entire institutional framework up in a particular manner that facilitates short contracts, easy hiring and firing, the general downplaying or absence of unions, no implementation of minimum wage, etc. So the entire idea behind that paradigm of thinking is that one is able to keep the labor market as flexible as possible, and that one is able to achieve uh, a, a tendency towards an equilibrium in the labor market, which is not impacted or constrained by any institutional or legislative or regulatory uh, form of rigidity that would affect it. So that in itself is a Keynesian construct, and the entire discourse which you see emerging in modern macroeconomic management and modern labor economics is as a result of that entire school of thought. The second very important element for understanding the Keynesian mindset that prevailed during this golden era of capitalism, as it's referred to, is that there is a powerful political economy argument that liberal democracies will not tolerate for long periods high and persistent levels of unemployment. Now, as I would have mentioned previously, in previous classes, I would have touched on this a bit. One has to take into consideration that when we speak about the economy and when we speak about the management of a macroeconomy, we are not speaking about something which, as I would have mentioned earlier, we can isolate in a lab and we can operate or test on it the same way that we would in perhaps natural sciences, in particular physics. We are dealing in an environment where those who are the decision makers are placed there as a result of a political process. And if one understands the notion of political economy and um, public life and public voting patterns, one would know that in making decisions, it is not only a consideration on what is economically sound, but also what is socially just. And therefore, one will see that there is a tendency in liberal democracies where the democratic process actually functions well, and the election of a particular political actor is contingent on his or her performance in a previous term or in a previous public life, or in a previous job, then one would understand the reason why long and high and persistent levels of unemployment cannot be tolerated, irrespective of the fact that uh, scholars within the neoclassical paradigm have posited that if one leaves unemployment to take its natural course, that somehow it will automatically stop itself, or it will have the tendency to self-equilibrate or go back to the equilibrium which it is meant to. So that in itself points towards the direction that shows us that when decisions are to be made, that they cannot be made in vacuums, and decisions that we see occurring in that space ought to be made with consideration for broader political economy um, constructs. So that is the second very important element of what we refer to as the Keynesian mindset. The other is the fact that investment opportunities may slow in highly developed economies, and this may lead to steady state or secular stagnation. Now, if one may recall adequately, in, for example, macroeconomics, I think it would have been intermediate macroeconomics, when one reviews the Solow-Swan growth model, there is a tendency for the economy, particularly developed economies, to move towards what is called a steady state. And this is as a result of an economy reaching its maximum capacity and being unable to force the economic growth process much further on. Fundamental to this is the fact that no more spare capacity exists in the economy. And therefore, as a result, um, one has to understand that secular stagnation process within the labor market construct that is provided. So the reason why that is important is that the growth process or the output process for uh, the real sector, what is called the real sector side of the economy, ties naturally back into the labor market side of the economy. Why is that so? Because remember, in, for example, intermediate macroeconomics, when you're studying it at the elementary level, you understand that when you say Y, you are also referring to E. And so Y comma E is equal to. So when we speak about output reaching its maximum capacity, we also speak about the notion of employment nearing a maximum capacity. And the reason that that construct is important within the Keynesian mindset is that one has to necessarily know the spare capacity which exists in the economy to be able to ascertain if um, policies that drive aggregate demand forward will actually be able to drive unemployment down. Now, this is an important linchpin, if you will, in the notion of Keynesian macroeconomic management, because it is Keynes's failing in thoroughly on analyzing um, this element of it that causes the general theory, quote unquote, to actually break down. Um, Now, as we go through the gamut of this course, you'll begin to understand more about that. Because when the evidence is provided about what happens during the 1970s, through the breakdown of the Phillips curve and that entire Keynesian consensus coming to an end, one begins to see how that understanding therefore becomes important in Keynes's longevity. Now, the fourth element of the Keynesian mindset that is important during this period is that of faith in statistical forecasting. Now, it is for the first time that economists are actually encouraged to model and model out scenarios, model out information which is being provided through the labor market and such the like. Now, the reason that that construct actually arises is as a result of Keynes's understanding of interplay in the economy, and the way that he advances the interrelation between the four sectors of the economy. And so those are four very important elements which we ascertain arising in this Keynesian mindset, if you will, during this period. So um, as we move through orthodoxy of Keynesianism, the very first um, what is referred to by Snowden and Vane in their 2005 Modern Macroeconomics text as the Mark I version of Keynesianism. The four hallmarks of that orthodox Keynesianism, or that Mark I version of Keynesianism, or version one of it, um, we see a few patterns emerging. So that the economy is inherently unstable, subject to erratic shocks. These shocks are attributed primarily to changes in the marginal efficiency of investment following a change in the state of business confidence, or what Keynes refers to as animal spirits. Now, this is important in my view, because as I have always tried to advance, is that there is an element of management of an economy that is not dependent solely on injecting money into the economy, governments investing through the fiscal program, etc. But it also has to do with intangibles. And this is where perhaps a nexus is formed between economics and social psychology, where animal spirits, as Keynes refers to it, um, how does the interplay of social behavior drive a particular actor to act or to behave within the economy? So why is it that when an economy begins to tank, people just automatically pull their money out? Why it is that when one person sees their friend or their fellow investor not investing in particular stocks, they will go do the same? You know, when one looks at, for example, Warren Buffett, all that he really has to do as an investor is not invest in a stock if he does not want that particular stock to rise, because essentially he is a leading investor, and that notion of him actually investing and leading through his investment in the financial market is one which depicts the influence of singular individuals on the collective, or what Keynes refers to as animal spirits. There's a wonderful book written, actually, I think it's by Robert Skidelsky, on animal spirits. I actually have had it. I think it's left in my other library. But it's a wonderful text. If I do have it, I'll send it over to you, because for me, I think that this is one of the very important contributions of Keynes, because he actually demonstrates here that he has a greater understanding of economics than was prevailing at the time. So this notion of animal spirits, of course, of the global recession of 2008, or the Great Recession, demonstrates is very important in understanding contemporary markets, particularly mature financial markets, which have complex instruments and are well developed. So that is the first one, this construct of animal spirits, and the notion that an economy operates with erratic shocks, and that contribution of the business cycle. Of course, Keynes is not the first, the only, and the lone scholar to speak about this, but he is the one that actually begins to tie it in to macroeconomic management. And this is an important point, because it actually demonstrates that actions of particular actors, or actions of particular entities, for example, governments, for example, leading private sector individuals, do have great impacts on the state of confidence in the economy, and consequently the rate of investment or capital formation in the economy. So that's the first hallmark of that Mark One orthodox Keynesianism. The second is that the economy is not a rapidly self-equilibrating economy, and I think that that notion is well understood by now. That this entire complex interplay which we study, called the economy, does not automatically move towards equilibrium, irrespective of the fact that equilibrium is what we would ideally uh, want. You see, this neoclassicism is actually borrowing the construct or the rubrics that are used in physics, where uh, a particular action will have a tendency towards equilibrium, and in the absence of another physical matter directly placing a stop on that on that uh, on that let me see how to term it best. uh, if there is some matter that is moving towards equilibrium, the only way that it can be stopped is if some other third party force directly intervenes on that matter's movement towards its equilibrated position. And so, because the the framework is borrowed from a different uh, environment, when one tries to institute it in this environment, in an economy where you're dealing with humans, where you're dealing with confidence, where you're dealing with a number of other variables that can intervene, and you don't have this axiomatic approach that creates a vacuum, um, then we begin to understand that an economy cannot rapidly move towards the position um, that the neoclassicals advance as a self-equilibrating economy. And that becomes a hallmark of orthodox Keynesianism. The third very important point of this entire orthodox Keynesianism is the fact that aggregate output is influenced by aggregate demand. Now, remember, we would have made the point that neoclassicism and that uh, that version of neoclassicism that is based on the extension of the marginal analysis considered very strongly only the supply side of the economy, and did not take into consideration the demand side of the economy. The reason for that, of course, is as a result of Say's law, that supply creates its own demand, the succinct form of Say's law being supply creating its own demand. Um, what, however, was failed to be analyzed by those scholars, was the fact that when they are referring to lowering of cost of production through cutting of wages, or lowering of cost of production by lowering the factor of production called wages, in its value, is the fact that they are lowering wages that accrue to individuals. And it is those very same wages that accrue to individuals which in turn creates the demand in the economy. And as such, one cannot only view the economy from that particular perspective, but we also would have to take into account what the demand side is. And so this is where cutting wages too low, especially as one begins to go into a recession, becomes an issue. And so if one takes into account, for example, maybe what happened in the euro crisis in Greece in 2011, when the economy began to tank as a result of the financial contagion associated with the 2008 global recession, um, instead of responding to the crisis by uh, through monetary and fiscal policy expansion. Greece actually took austerity measures, which actually made the situation much worse. And of course, it's um, a much more complex uh, occurrence than the narrative I just presented. But essentially, the fact that they attempted to do austerity during a period of global recession and during a period of low global output only made the economy much worse. Of course, Greece, being attached to the euro area, does not have the ability to set its independent monetary policy. And so when one examines it within what we call in macroeconomics the macroeconomic trilemma, you would see that there is the elimination of monetary policy, and it has an effect, therefore, on exchange rate and capital formation in that macroeconomic trilemma. So, not to belabor the point, but only to say that it becomes very important to be able to manage aggregate demand through wages, through expansioning or expansional fiscal and monetary policy during times when there is downturn. So this construct of managing the aggregate output through aggregate demand management, or what we call as AD management, or the effectual demand management or effective demand management, is another hallmark of orthodox Keynesianism. And the fourth is that for stabilization, fiscal policy is preferred over monetary policy. Now, the reason for this is very simple. It is said, and it has been proven, that for most economies, fiscal policy tends to be more potent in the economy. Of course, if we take a look at different IS curves in economies around the world, you will see that um, of the coefficient of determination for the IS curve is much more steep in its nature than that of monetary policy. And once the coefficient of determination is higher in the creation of the IS curve over the LM curve in the Higgs-Hansen framework, one would understand that fiscal policy therefore becomes more potent in its ability than monetary policy. And therefore, as a result, for stabilization, given its greater potency, fiscal policy is preferred for macroeconomic management than that of monetary policy. Of course, a scholar who comes subsequent to Keynes and, of course, promotes this school known as monetarism, none other than Milton Friedman, um, believes that whilst there is an important role for fiscal policy in a very limited sense in his work, Capitalism as Freedom, uh, he clearly delineates and actually spends the remainder of his life arguing the point that so as to avoid this road to serfdom that Frederick Hayek refers to, we need to avoid high levels of fiscal interventions by governments and go towards monetary injections and monetary or money management of the economy. Because once you begin to expand the powers of government, then you end up with an issue of them interjecting themselves into various elements of life for a free individual in a free society, which may not necessarily bode or augur well for democracy at its fundamental level. Now, and that, of course, is why he writes the very noble work, Capitalism as Freedom. For those who are interested, I think I can perhaps send some work for you to review in that regard. So, now, the Keynesian policy orientation is based in what we know as the national income identity. And that this is of course very elementary, and it works therefore through that multiplier effect. And working through that multiplier effect, we oftentimes deem government spending, or G, as being the one that will actually be able to regulate the business cycle. And this is where the role for responsible fiscal policy by government comes into play. So a government will invest or spend $3 billion, and out of that, workers will receive some amount, um, and procurement by government will occur. Now, as a result of both of these actions, what you'll see, for example, in the years subsequent to the government investing, you will see, for example, maybe say shops and pubs seeing increases in demand. There may be increased demand for transport and utilities, and suppliers, as a result of the fact that they have received new orders and have capital injection, may employ more workers. And therefore, the initial injection being $3 billion works its way through the economy. And as a result, more value is created. And once more value is created as a result of that multiplier effect, what you end up with is a situation where an investment or an injection by government leads to a greater than increase in uh, in the output that is produced. Now, this is a very important point, because the it actually makes the argument for responsible fiscal policy by government. Now, when one looks, for example, at the channels through which value is created, it is based on activities where the private sector will benefit, um, or workers may directly benefit. Now, we know what the issues are, of course, with workers benefiting from too much increases from governments. Oftentimes, wages, as we know, is tied to productivity. And in government jobs, there is not enough monitoring of productivity. And so when one begins to push too much into the economy um, through the hands of workers in situations where there is not a recessive state, then we can end up with some amount of inflationary impact. And so this is the reason why it is important to ensure that it is channeled through the private sector, where the economic benefit will not only be limited to workers and workers' consumption, but also when channeled through the private sector, it can create more employment for workers as a result of the private sector expansion. And so this is fundamentally where a government ought to go. It is important, of course, to ensure that workers do receive some amount of increase, and they are able to offset the inflationary effects that will occur during the year with increases in salary. But it is always beneficial, or more beneficial, to ensure that that dollar is spent in a particular um, subset of that national income identity where the multiplier effect will be the largest. And we know naturally that the hold for me. We know naturally that the investment portion of the national income identity tends to have the greatest potency. So um, this entire multiplier effect is mapped in to something which is I don't think that you guys have been introduced to, but it's something called the eclectic aggregate supply curve. And it is no it's no long no old type of thinking. This is something that is relatively new actually in economics, to combine all three ranges of the aggregate supply curve. And so this is the reason why um, we dispense, or I dispense, with the thinking of short term, long term, and so on, in making reference to macroeconomic management, because it all depends on the state of the economy at the point in time. So an action, for example, through fiscal policy, um, which may be inflationary at one point in time, may not necessarily be inflationary at another point in time. And the aggregate supply curve gives us an understanding as to why that is so. Because take, for example, here we divide the economy, or we divide the state of the economy into three different ranges. The first is what is called the Keynesian range. And this is a period where an economy is in a general recessive state. Um, and it is going through one of those bust periods in, or it has gone through a bust period in the cycle, and you can consider it to be a recessive state. The intermediate range is one where an economy is beginning to pick up from that depressive or recessive state that it was in, and so we begin to see a bit of a normal reaction of price level to output. So that intermediate range, as we see it there, is one which is sloped. And then in the classical range is where we see the what of course we refer to as being the LRAS, or the long run aggregate supply, with that vertical aggregate supply curve. And it's referred to in this manner because from Keynes' perspective, Keynes, as you may go through his work, you'll realize that much of what Keynes is advancing, his focus is so heavily driven on aggregate demand that yes, he is correct in what he postulates, but the fact that he focuses on continuously driving expansion of the economy through aggregate demand increases creates a situation that when an economy actually exits a recessive state, if one continues to apply more and more doses of fiscal policy in an expansionary form that Keynes recommends, that you can end up with an inflationary situation. So the Keynesian range and holds true in a situation of recessive um, or a situation of recession, where the aggregate supply curve will actually be seen to be horizontal. And therefore, if one takes into consideration an aggregate demand curve being at this range here, if one applies a dose of expansionary fiscal policy, let's say, for example, perhaps through government expenditure and giving workers more money, and you increase that aggregate demand, you'll see that in that recessive state, it has an impact on real GDP or real output without having a concomitant impact on the price level. Now, that in itself becomes important because um, you are essentially pushing output from the economy without that implication on price level, which has adverse welfare effects. And so, in that state of recession or within the Keynesian range, we actually do see benefit from applying heavy doses of aggregate demand of fiscal policy through aggregate demand. As we approach some normalcy or some degree of normal conditions, naturally applying heavier doses of aggregate demand will cause some amount of inflation. But it is expected that the benefit from the additional output will offset that welfare impacting effect of inflation that we see occurring during the intermediate range. Now, in that full employment state, or when an economy tends towards full employment, um, the considerations that ought to be made, therefore, become much more serious. Um, and so, if we notice, if one has, for example, perhaps an aggregate demand curve here, and we apply a heavy dose of fiscal policy to it, we will not have much impact on output, but we will greatly impact the notion of uh, inflation. And that in itself becomes an issue because we know through later analysis of rational expectations that an inflationary bout tends to spiral upwards as a result of an economy working its multiplier effect and what is known as overheating in the economy. Now, this is why when one studies, for example, an oil and gas economy, and you see talks about great expenditure um, on infrastructure, it is something that has to necessarily be paced, because if you have an economy that is expanding, but you tend to you overheat the economy through adding heavier doses of capital injection through fiscal policy, um, and the rate of demand grows much faster than the rate of at which the aggregate supply grows, then you will end up in a situation of an inflationary bout, which in itself um, can create deleterious welfare impacting situation for the average consumer. And this is why, if one examines the public policy discourse surrounding the oil and gas economies, you'll see them talking about public financial management reform, where one has to ensure that there is what is called an expenditure growth rule in application or in practice by the governments, because an expenditure growth rule actually limits how much fiscal intervention there can be by a government from year to year. So, the final slide here this afternoon will show you the impact of uh, the market, the real sector, to or at various points of the aggregate, the eclectic aggregate supply curve. So if we note the impact here in an intermediate state, you will see that the increases in the price level are not as much as the increases in output, which means therefore that the net benefit or the net welfare effect is positive for those actors in the economy. However, as that economy begins to approach its full employment level, or when it's at its full employment level, um, we see that applications of doses of aggregate demand through, for example, fiscal policy, will have a deleterious effect on the welfare of consumers. The reason for that is that the increases in the price level far outweigh the increases in the aggregate output. Now, if one continues to force the economy forward in a state of this being, then you will find that you will enter into a situation of hyperinflation. Now, this becomes extraordinarily important in understanding a modern labor market. The reason for that is that when one takes this exact framework and flips it from looking at it from the real sector or the goods sector or the output market, and analyzes this on the labor market side, then you'll begin to see that these actually have implications on that price unemployment trade-off that one sees in, or inflation unemployment trade-off that one sees in the Phillips curve. So this is the reason that understanding Keynes and the macroeconomic aspect, or the macroeconomic outlook of this, is important. So just to ensure that you are familiarized with it, I'd like you to, of course, review all of the material which I have provided to you, and we'll, of course, end here this afternoon with the intention of driving the lessons forward. So, any questions or discussions we can, of course, have at this time. I'll stop the recording now.